October 31st, 1998. To date, your tips have led to the capture of 530 fugitives. Tonight on America's Most Wanted, America Fights Back.
In the early morning hours of March 14th, firefighters and police responded to a car fire in an isolated field in Kentucky. They thought it was just another arson case, but it turned out to be murder. 73-year-old Lonetta White's body was found in the trunk. She'd been beaten to death.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, catching killers with America's Most Wanted. Welcome back to the Murder Police Podcast. I am Wendy.
And I'm David.
Well, David, today we are going to talk about what it's like to catch killers while using America's Most Wanted. And I understand several years back, we won't tell how many, you actually utilized America's Most Wanted and John Walsh, the host, to try to catch a couple of suspects. Is that right?
It is. I got to thinking that it was a pretty unique experience, and I know it was one of the most popular TV shows ever produced. It's a little iffy if it'll be back this year. It's come and gone a few times. But we used it on a few cases at work, and I definitely used it on the case we're going to talk about a little bit about today. I thought it'd be neat if the listeners could step behind the scenes to see what it's like when those are being created and how that works internally to produce what they see on TV.
Yeah, I know that show started off roughly in 1988. I used to be an avid watcher of it, which shouldn't surprise you since I love anything crime. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how John Walsh got started with that? I know most of our listeners know it's, or maybe they don't know, due to the loss of his son, Adam. It was an abduction in 1981 and subsequently a murder. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that show?
That was the catalyst, I think, that set John on fire with that tragic and brutal loss of his small child in 81 and then recovering, I believe, parts of his body. And it really triggered him into feeling like a lot of people do when they suffer that loss, that they have to do more. So his family founded a thing called the Adam Walsh Child Resource Center, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to legislative reform. One of the things they looked at back early in 81 was how quickly missing person children investigations are started. When are they put in the National Crime Information or NCIC system? And to try to get better legislation across the states to serve families of these missing people better. Now, that eventually merged with what we know as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC. And John Walsh actually serves on the board of directors. Or the last time I looked, he was on the board of directors, so it combined in there. The show has been on and off the air up until this year of 2021 and 2022. It could go back on this year without John, but it's still in limbo. The last I looked today on the internet, they're not too sure if it's going to renew or not. What's neat is that when I got to get with the production staff, they talked about its wild popularity. At one time, it even overshadowed The Simpsons TV show, which is quite a feat back then. They told me that it was probably one of the most expensive non-money-making shows that they produced at the Fox Media Network because you can't really put it into reruns. Everything is so timely based on, here's some people that are wanted this week, let's go get them. So it had no rerun residual value to them. Every time they tried to drop it over the years, the public backlash was so big they brought it back alive. It was just, again, wildly popular.
Yeah, and I think that is really before true crime even started. I mean, back in 88. You know, and I always thought what was so unique about that show is that because it was live and pretty current, just the whole nation getting together, because you know somebody always knows something. So if they just reach out and call that tip line, hopefully someone who's wanted, most likely a killer, is caught. Yeah, I'm certainly hoping it comes back on because it seems like there were a lot of people apprehended because of that show.
I agree. It created a synergy and a momentum of its own to where, unlike these days, there was a genuine interest in let's go get the bad guys and bring them to justice and bring justice to those surviving victim families. It was pretty unique.
Well, and I think, like you said, these days, unfortunately, a lot of people know who is committing murders or they've seen it, and nobody ever wants to say anything. It's kind of this, let's keep it secret. I know who did it, but I'm not going to tell. And, and that may be all well and fine when it's somebody not close to you, but I assure you when it's one of your own, you want that suspect apprehended.
Absolutely. That's a huge problem that's hampering investigations across the country right now.
Well, I know this case that you covered is one that back in our early dating days we talked about, and I've been begging you for years to talk about this publicly, and more so since we've begun this podcast. And I know we're not going to dive into it a lot today, but why don't you tell our listeners about this 1998 murder that you covered, that you reached out to America's Most Wanted for?
Yeah, eventually I think we're going to cover it. We have to do it pretty carefully, and it's a very complex, deep case. And when you see what ended up happening to the suspect, you'll understand why. But we're going to have to piece that together pretty carefully if we decide to do it. You're right. This case was the 1998 murder of a Lexington resident named Lonetta White. She was 73 years old. And the gist of it is that year we got a call from the fire department at around 3 a.m. in a rural area in Fayette County, which is Lexington. A car was on fire. In the process of them extinguishing that fire, when they popped the trunk, there was a body in it. And not to go into too much detail, but within the first several hours, the car was traced back to an address, which was where Lonetta White lived, and a crime scene was discovered there, a very brutal, very violent crime scene. And she was ultimately identified as the victim in that car. And just to let you know, the autopsy revealed the death was due to multiple blows to her head, likely with some kind of a hammer or some kind of instrument like that. What's interesting is within that first 48 hours is we started to get really good tip information from the streets and from informants about somebody or some people that would be involved. And that's where this went, is that when we started to be able to focus on them and get probable cause for warrants, you're going to hear real quick why we had to use America's Most Wanted. And again, the cool thing is I'm going to tell you what it's like to work with that production crew and what's really going on.
So we know that, or I know that subsequently these two suspects were arrested. Can you tell us who they were?
Well, the first person we started getting information on was a woman that lived here in Lexington named Virginia Caudill. And eventually, through interviews, an interview with her actually too, we named a second co-defendant with a friend of hers, and actually they were drug-using buddies more than anything else, named Jonathan Heavy Goforth, and he was also from the Lexington area. The thing is, they weren't arrested for murder early on. There just wasn't enough evidence to begin with when we did that. And this is where it gets frustrating in this business, is that I remember we located Virginia within that first 48 hours and picked her up on a misdemeanor warrant that was out of Fayette County. Not a big deal. She was interviewed, taken to jail, and bonded out quickly. Now, in the interview, again, not a whole lot of detail, but in the interview, she denied anything to do with Lonetta's death, but she also gave us a lot of information that advanced the case, even though she didn't mean to. We've always talked, and all the other detectives talk about it, if you're not going to tell me the truth, I want you to lie real big, and we won't go into that, but it advanced it. The tricky part was in that even though you strongly suspected that, and at that time we were having potential physical evidence arrive that was amazing, you just didn't have enough to hold her for murder. That's a frustrating job. But again, we've talked before, we have this thing called the Constitution, and we have to play inside the coloring lines in the coloring book. They weren't arrested right away, and certainly she was actually in our presence for a while till we transported her to the jail, and she bonded out on a misdemeanor warrant.
So you let her go despite your suspicions.
Yeah, we had to.
She was involved.
Yeah. Strong suspicions. I mean, there was a lot of things circumstantially trying to form up, but It wasn't enough. There wasn't enough direct witness statements or good confirmed physical evidence, although the evidence that we were getting really looked hopeful. And so we did. We just had to. It's hard to do, but it's part of doing this job.
Now, with Jonathan, you said you called him heavy. Had Virginia told you about Jonathan's involvement, or did other people tell you about this guy, and why was he called heavy?
Well, yeah, heavy, he wasn't. I mean, he was fit. I mean, nothing heavy. I guess that's just something from his childhood or friends or something called him that. That's what he was known as. Now, you asked a good question is, yes.
I usually do.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, on both counts, is that during her interview, she indicated being with him. But at about the same time, and we've talked before how there's a huge team of people out there doing interviews. At about the same time we were interviewing her, some of our street sources and informants were talking about him too. That's where we started picking that name up. Now, with him, once we got his name and tried to locate him, we just wanted to knock out an interview because we felt strongly about her. And at that time, he was definitely a potential person of interest, but we were staying open-minded because this is an association at this time, and we were feeling it out. I remember trying to find him. Our informants were trying to find him. I remember going to a home where he lived with a woman, and she hadn't seen him in a couple of days. And I left a business card with, this is dating myself, my pager number.
Why don't you tell our listeners what that is?
Well, I'll let them Google it. We'll just let them do some independent research on a pager, but that's also just how much of an antique I am. But regardless, what happened is eventually, and there's much more to that story that we won't dig into today, but eventually I get a phone call from him. And he actually agrees. He's super cooperative on the phone. Sounds like a nice guy. He agrees that you tell me the date and the time and I'll come down and we'll knock out an interview. He's willing to do that. Great. We set up a time. We set up a date. And probably just a few minutes after he was supposed to be there, I get one more phone call from him, from a payphone. And he assures me, I'm on my way. I just had to stop at an ATM. I think maybe even he might have mentioned something to pay his lawyer. But hey, I'm late, but I'll be there.
I bet he lied, didn't he?
A teensy bit,
yeah.
Because I never saw him after that. He was in the wind. That's just happens sometimes, is that he came off really good. And of course, in that moment, that's what you're left with. That's the device you're using and the tool, because we couldn't go see him personally to invite him down. So the phone was always had, and he hit the wind after that.
So I'm guessing because there was not an arrest on either of these two, that is why America's Most Wanted got involved. Is that the case?
It is, because we started getting information from different people and different sources that they had fled the state. There was information in some sources saying they were definitely headed south. We didn't hear anything north. And for example, I think there was some information that we got a call one day of the secretarial staff in Bureau of Investigation took a call from somebody that said that Virginia was on her way to Florida. Going on the run like that, our information sources, again, our street resources, our informants, were really trying to locate them for her. As a matter of fact, the first time we got to talk to Virginia was because of a information source that located her. We weren't having any luck. What's going on at the same time is that evidence is starting to be evaluated and analyzed. More witness statements of people that spoke to them or saw them in different places are coming together. The follow-ups from Virginia's information is tightening those two together. At some point, we actually started to recover some of the things that were actually taken from Lonetta's home, and we could put them into possession, example, for Jonathan Goforth. So the case started to really go from maybe to feel strongly till we got to the point where we had probable cause to go get many different arrest warrants. But of course, the primary one is murder. We had enough probable cause on that. Tons of evidence. I remember speaking to the victim's adult son one time and telling him that, physical evidence in homicide cases is really not as common as people make it out to be in the movies. A lot of it's circumstantial. A lot of it is people saying and witness statements. This case had things coming out of the woodwork that were fascinating. Forensic evidence, physical evidence, stolen property, hair, fiber, all of that was coming together. So what happens? They're on the road. We can't find them, but we finally get enough to do these warrants, which means we can put them in the National Crime Information Center, NCIC computer, as wanted, which is the big net at that point. So if they're encountered by law enforcement can serve those warrants and we can get them in custody. We really needed something to help. So that's when I thought about using America's Most Wanted.
I'm assuming it's not just that easy, because if that's the case, everyone with a cold case murder or crime would reach out to America's Most Wanted. How did you entice John Walsh to take your case on?
Well, and you made a good point. Actually, if you have a cold case, unsolved murder, America's Most Wanted has nothing to do with it. It's Most Wanted. Keep that in mind. Now, the first exposure I had is when I got to the unit, is they did run one unsolved, and this was so rare for them to do, but it was the murder of Trent DeGiro here in Lexington. And the listeners can go back and listen to that fantastic series.
Yes, we covered that as well.
Yeah, but the thing is that I remember when they did that, Detective Don Evans was the person that contacted our production team, and something about that spoke to them. They flew in a crew. I went over to Woodland Avenue where he was murdered one night. They had the streets shut off. It was a huge production set with actors and things like that. Don hooked me up with the production crew, and I pitched the case to them. And fortunately, one of the producers I got hold of looked at it and said, yes. Now, are they picky? Yeah, I'll tell you what, here's the trick with it. And this is something that people get frustrated with today on transparency and what they think they all know about a case. Investigations, particularly murder investigations, things are held very closely to the chest by the investigators because they have to be for the integrity of the case and fair trial issues. When you work with America's Most Wanted, they want to make sure that everything you're talking about is verifiable. They don't want to step into a mess of things that aren't sure. For example, you're going to have warrants on people, and they're going to have to be entered. But another thing you have to do that I wasn't aware of is that they have to entertain the audience. And I don't mean that in a cheap way, but the audience, like anybody else, is like you said, I think this was one of the starts of the true crime fad, have to find this interesting. So here's the deal. When you present, you have to give them enough material and enough detail, including visuals sometimes, to be able to make this interesting and to grasp people's attention. So there's a tightrope you walk on. What do I release and what do I don't? And what you're doing is it's a risk versus rewards equation, to where if I really believe I've got a shot at getting these two violent people in custody and bringing them to justice, then just in this case, I'll release a little video out of the house. I'll release a couple pictures because, and I know we both never really see that on an open case. That's probably the trickiest part with working with them, is you have to make that risk versus reward with the Commonwealth Attorney, with the police department. These are the things you can have. And that seals the deal for them if they can get enough things to keep the interest of the viewer.
Before we move on to how that progressed, I feel like we need to give Officer Don Evans, who's retired, a shout out. I think he's pretty awesome. I know you all used to give him a hard time. So what does America's Most Wanted do at that point?
At that point, you start working with them on submitting the information. They'll have qualifying questions. They'll want a little more detail. It's more of and then we get back to that negotiation of how much they can have and what they need. They're not over demanding. They understand the importance of a case, so they don't really kill you for that. But so what happens is you start sending them case summaries. You send them photos, aliases, some of the crime scene photos and videos and things like that. They start to produce the case. In this case, they didn't come to Lexington. They did it remotely. They decided to air a thing that they called an APB or a BOLO, which is a short segment that basically says, here's the crime, here's the people, here's the pictures of them, here's what they're wanted for, go get them. I wasn't actually interviewed on that. I think we did some interviews later, but again, I have a face for radio, so that doesn't get used. And they did that quick thing where they put that APB out. If people go to our show notes at murderpolicepodcast.com, I will put copies of the original videos of the BOLO, and then I think I've got a video of when Virginia was actually captured. Now, what's neat, they didn't come here, but this is something I don't think people know. If they run a case, they fly you to D.C. on the night that the case airs. So you're in back then the studio was in Washington, D.C., and you're there for the live taping, which was neat. It was everything like you see on TV. They have all the call takers in that little horseshoe, and they have the forms there. When the case goes off, the phones start ringing, and they start to record those. That was neat. Now, what the second part of the deal is that if you're there that night when they're airing it, if a real hot tip comes in with legs, like it's probably valid, or somebody does capture somebody within a time period, they pack you up and they fly you with a production crew to wherever they are in the country to go and shoot the next episode.
Well, did you get to meet John Walsh?
No, that was kind of disappointing. His pieces are done in different studio recording things. Imagine that. I mean, that's the way it's done. So he wasn't there in the studio that night. I wish I had. That would have added to it. But again, everything else in there that was actual. That was real. When you see, if you look back at those episodes and you see somebody on a phone.
Well, John Walsh was always one of my ones that I wanted to meet because of his popularity and involvement in true crime. But as we know, Joe Kenda is my top want to meet guy. If anybody's a Joe Kenda watcher on television or reader, he's got 2 awesome books. But anyway, unfortunately, you didn't get to meet John Walsh. When did that show air? When did that show air involving Jonathan in Virginia?
That was on Halloween, October 31st, 1998. So we flew up there, got in the studio, and they let that little thing fly.
Bet you felt super famous, didn't you?
No, because you didn't see me in it. No. But it was a neat experience. I would never trade it. Yeah.
So did any tips come in from that?
There were, I think there were well over 30. And they came in that night, and they came in after that too. So there were a lot of tips that were flying in at the moment. And then I'll describe it in a minute, the tip stuff doesn't stop that first night. But yeah, we had maybe a little over 30.
So did that pan anything out for you all?
Not that night, no. None of them were strong enough to take an action on that time or put their hands on somebody. So it didn't work out that well that night.
So no luck at all?
Yep, not that night, but eventually it did.
Now, is that how you were able to arrest these? Because of the America's Most Wanted? Was it directly related?
Absolutely.
Really?
Yeah. Which I think that's the cool thing is it worked so well. As the tips came in, they're being evaluated, and back then people were going to laugh. They were writing them on these America's Most Wanted forms that were triple copy, carbonless copy, like a white and a pink and a yellow copy. And you would look at them that night in the studio to see what they were saying. And the tips that were coming in were anything from really specific to really broad. And sometimes they were like, grain of salt and everything. For example, there was one where somebody said they saw Goforth buying beer at a gas station in Mississippi. So it's like, maybe, you could never discount it. And then some of them were like, well, I think I saw them in a car driving here. So they were all kinds of places. What I did is when you go home, they keep mailing you updated sets of forms. So if more tips come in, you get updated. And I thought, instead of trying to evaluate those, and you certainly couldn't go everywhere the tip was, is I created dossier packets on the 2 suspects, on Caudill and Goforth. Each packet had as many photos of them I could find at different ages. It had a summary of the case. It had copies of the entries in the NCIC for the murder and the other charges that they're going to be charged with. And I'm pretty sure I included fingerprint cards in there and a copy of the tip. So what I did is I researched and found out what agencies were in those jurisdictions, sent them a packet and said, by the way, somebody in your jurisdiction has reportedly seen one or both of these suspects, and mailed all those out. That was a pretty neat process. Well,
I have to ask, was Jonathan really in Mississippi, or was that just a lead that didn't go anywhere?
Well, it worked out because the whole thing, it did work. So what would happen is, for example, the following month in November, the first person that was identified was Caudill, Virginia. There was a tip of somebody that said they were an inmate in a New Orleans parish prison and that she was in there. And I think they even said that she was going by the alias of Kelly Lyons, which I was flattered that she was using my name. I don't know if that was related to how she felt about me when we last talked or not, but that she was in there. So what happened is a jail guard called me and said she fessed up to being who she is. He walked in, held up the picture that I'd sent her, dropped her eyes and said, yeah, that's me. So that was a direct result of that tip saying that, because when I'd sent that packet to that New Orleans parish prison at work, what was interesting, she had been in jail there and got out and was back in. And even though her prints and everything were in NCIC, she wasn't identified the first time through. So it was a stroke of luck. She was in there for like shoplifting or something.
Well, that's why I was asking about the gas station in Mississippi, because if anybody Googles Jonathan, I mean, he could look like a number of people. I mean, if you saw somebody buying beer, there's really not any identifying things on him that makes you think that's definitely Jonathan Goforth.
That's why I put a broad net, because my feeling is, I don't think anybody can like pick him out of a phone lineup. But and you're right, he's not remarkable, or most of us aren't remarkable in any way, but the idea is that if it's possible, then you put that and it was an awareness tool. And it worked, like I said, with Virginia, because we flew down and interviewed her. And this time when we interviewed her, it was completely different than that first time at police headquarters.
So you actually flew down to Louisiana and interviewed her. Now, what did she say? And I know you are wanting to save all these details for when we do the actual case, but can you just give us a little snippet of what she said and if Jonathan ever got caught?
Well, her interview was incredibly valuable. We'll leave it at that. And I will say that she implicated Jonathan. Yeah, it was very valuable. She actually implicated him as being there. And again, if we ever do the case, I can go into more detail about what those statements were. That was a huge help. Now, Goforth, yeah, he did get caught. About a month after that, in December of 1998, we get a call from Gulfport Police Department in Harrison County, Mississippi, and he's in custody like she was down there, and he's using an alias. Now, what was unique about this, this is great police work. A captain with the Gulfport Police Department had charged him with a crime revolving around sexual abuse of a minor child. He was in jail and he gave a name, but the captain knew the real person of the name he was using. So let's say that the name was John Doe. The captain knew John Doe, and he's like, that's not who you are. So he really got interested in trying to figure out who was using this alias. He even sent the fingerprints off the FBI one time, and they came back with no result on the warrant being there and matching his fingerprints. And the captain told me, he said, one day I went back to my desk and sat at my cubicle, and he looked up, and he had taken my packet and thumbtacked all that stuff on his corkboard in front of his desk, and he said, I looked up, and there he was staring back at me. What he did is he did not let Jonathan know that he had made him yet, but he called and we flew down to Gulfport and code called Jonathan and met him down there. And Jonathan at first didn't want to talk until we kind of let him know that Virginia was throwing him under the bus and he was about to get all the wheels on the bus, and he decided to talk too.
So what did Jonathan say in his interview?
Good try, but we're not going to get into that detail right now. However, he, like anybody else, he did tell enough to advance the case. I will say that he put himself at the scene, but it became a finger-pointing thing at that point. And if we cover the case, we'll learn more about that.
So did anyone else get arrested?
Not for these charges.
Okay.
Not for these charges. They were it. They were the only two. And of course, the evidence, DNA was slow then, but the evidence continued to mount and mount and mount. They were both extradited back to Kentucky, which is that process that you can agree to go back and be put into the justice system in the jurisdiction where you're charged, or you can fight it. Well, I believe they both waived and came back. And eventually, sometime later, they went to a full jury trial.
So what happened to them? Where are they today?
Well, the jury convicted both of them on all the charges and gave them both the death penalty here in Kentucky. So they're both in prison, I believe, and I'm pretty sure that Virginia Caudill is still in Pee Wee Valley at the correctional facility there. Jonathan is at Eddyville, which is the maximum security state prison here in Kentucky. They're both, the jury really, I think, saw the horrendousness of this crime against a retired woman in her 70s that was just living her best life when she was murdered.
So I guess it's safe to say that America's Most Wanted helped you in solving this case.
It did. And you know what? I think that's what's cool about that whole thing that they started years ago. It's solved a lot of cases. It got them in custody, which led to the solving of the case. That's kind of two different things, but without them in custody, we would have never got in front of a jury, obviously, and they could still be out running, and they're both dangerous people. So in the end, it's that whole thing we opened up with is with the public, and it comes back to that thing we hear all the time. If you see something, say something. How powerful that is and how people need that to work. Well, I'll just add one more time, too, is that if the listeners go to murderpolicepodcast.com, they can actually look at those videos from back in 1998 when America's Most Wanted produced those.
Thank you, David, and I will look forward to interviewing you on this Lonetta White case. I know I've been asking you for some time, but until then, listeners, if you've not heard our Trent DeGiro case, which also references back to the America's Most Wanted, please go and listen to that. And as always, thank you for listening to the Murder Police Podcast.
Thank you again. And if you see something, say something. The Murder Police Podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about the presenters, and much, much more. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed captions for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police Podcast and you will find us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast from. Make sure to subscribe to the Murder Police Podcast and set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.